Hi everyone, I am Annette Smith. Welcome to the Chocolatier's Kitchen podcast, our last podcast in this series. Today, I have two chefs from the Chocolate Academy UK here with me in the studio. They both were co-authors of the Chocolatier's Kitchen book, Claire England and Mark Telling. How are you both doing?
Hey Minette, thank you for having us.
Hey Minette, how are you? Really good to talk about shelf life today.
Well, chefs, very happy to have both of you here.
The Chocolatier's Kitchen. After the book, listen to the podcast series about shelf life in confectionery products.
Now, when you were both asked to write contributions for the book and to take shelf life as lead concept, how and where did you start? Claire, maybe let's go with you first.
Shelf life is a massive subject, as we know from listening to all the podcasts so far. I tend to look at the ingredients that I want to use first. I think about, what do I want to do for a short shelf life product? Can I use the freshest ingredients possible? So for a shorter shelf life, I'd be looking at maybe using fresh herbs, fresh fruits. And then if I want to make a longer shelf life product with those fruits, with those herbs, how am I going to translate that? So am I going to be using sort of purees or fruit compounds, things like that? So I tend to look at the ingredients first.
And Mark, how did you go about the concept of shelf life?
Well, I looked at my older recipes, to be honest. I looked at some of my classic recipes, then I sort of tested them to see what the shelf life was, and then tried to sort of adapt that shelf life with different sugars to make it more of a longer shelf life. Or, like Claire said, if I wanted to use more of a fresh fruit than an actual sort of concentrated fruit puree, then I would adapt the recipe in that case as well.
Now, in our previous podcasts, we've heard a few interesting ideas. One of the central ideas is that shelf life is a business decision. Of course, you want to develop great, fresh and beautiful products, but you only start developing recipes after thinking first about how fast you will be able to sell them, and that's where managing shelf life really plays a crucial role. What's your opinion about that?
Well, that's quite an interesting question, actually, Minette. I previously made chocolates for a shop, and you really need to know your customer. That's the thing. And obviously, when you're starting out, you're not going to sell a lot of chocolates. So when I started, I made very much fresh chocolates because that's the way I wanted to go. But I was seeing that obviously I wasn't selling that much at the time. So then I had to change and do more longer shelf life and had a few fresher chocolates. But for me, it's all about, knowing your customer, and that will build over time. And that's what I think you need to sort of concentrate on, is to see who your customer is and how much you're going to sell at that particular point.
Yeah, I agree. The customers really play a key role in this. And Claire, your view on this?
Yeah, I'd like to echo what Mark says, really. It's about your customer, but also your story as a business. You as a business owner, sort of chef developer, you know who your customer is. So you can sort of make your product specifically for these people. You can tell your story with that, so that if you want to have a range of shorter shelf life, you say this to your customers. You say, these are really fresh, you have to eat them within this certain amount of time. But if you know your customer is not that type of person, that they tend to purchase it as gifts maybe, then you need to have a longer shelf life, because that gift needs to be able to last for it to be maybe transported, waited for the occasion, and then given as a gift. So I think it's about understanding who your customer is, understanding who you are as a business, and just telling that story.
Now that's really interesting, Claire. So let's make shelf life a bit more concrete. Suppose I've started up my business. You probably may not have any idea yet of the rotation of your products and what the minimal shelf life should be. What would be your advice to any starting chocolatier then?
So I would definitely do a longer shelf life recipe to start with, most definitely. Like from the previous question, I was talking to you about the shop that I worked in. So definitely a longer shelf life. It's good for seasonal times as well. So you can make enough for, say, like Christmas, say like for Easter. So you can make them way in advance. So you're not rushing, especially when you start a new business. You're not going to have, 100 staff helping you at that point. It's just going to be you on your own. So for me, the longer shelf life, the more time you have to make those chocolates, the better, especially towards those more seasonal requests.
And that's a very valid point you make there, Mark. And you, Claire, what is your thoughts?
Yeah, I tend to agree with Mark, to be honest. I would always suggest a mixture would be nice, but it can give yourself a bit of a headache, especially when you're starting up. you really need to balance your time between selling, advertising, making. There's so much to do as a business. So if you can give yourself a longer shelf life, then it means you're not having to make so many products quite so often, because they'll simply last longer.
And how does the new book, The Chocolatier's Kitchen, help you in managing your shelf life better?
Oh, well, that's an easy question to answer. It's because we give you the short, medium and long shelf life in there. I mean, what more can you get than that? It's a fantastic book. We have all of that in there for that customer. When I was growing up, we didn't have anything like that. And I wish I had that at that point, because then I would know my shelf life straight away. So yeah, I think that's the most important thing in the book, obviously, as well as all the fantastic recipes.
Yeah, I think as well, I would hope that it would give chocolatiers and chefs some confidence, having those different shelf lives. We've tested them. We've made those recipes quite a few times. And so I hope it gives confidence that you can trust it. Obviously, there needs to be parameters around things. So your hygiene and everything else needs to be really good. But, if we say it's a medium shelf life product, then hopefully if you make it the way that we've told you to make it, then it should be a medium shelf life product.
Now, you've both mentioned some really interesting points. Understanding the shelf life also means you need to be able to one way or another control it. What would be the best accessible tools to control or even measure the shelf life, knowing that not everyone has access to an expensive AW meter to measure the water activity in the recipe?
Yeah, so sometimes we do get a bit hung up on the water activity, because it's not the be all and end all of shelf life. Not everyone has one of these expensive pieces of kit. There's a really good method of calculating moisture in your ganache or your product. And it is simply just looking at each ingredient that's in there, working out what the water content is, and then just having a look at that overall moisture content. Too much moisture is going to be a problem, just because it gives that environment where bacteria can grow. We've got sugars, we've got moisture. It's a potential problem. All the chefs have discussed various different things during this podcast, and there's so many solutions, but it's having this idea of just understanding how much moisture is in there. Is it locked away? Are you using those different sugars and things to lock it away? And just taking an overall picture, really. But I think if you can calculate your moisture in your recipe, that gives you a good base to then look at.
So Claire, you mentioned calculation of moisture content. Can you maybe just do a little bit of a deep dive into the percentage of moisture and calculation of that in your recipe?
Yeah, so this is a really good way to get a rough idea of what's going on with your ganache. You take each ingredient, you work out how much water is in there, and then you can get an overall percentage of how much water is in your recipe. What this doesn't take into account, though, is your method. For instance, if you've got a caramel recipe, you might have quite a lot of moisture in the actual recipe, but the process of cooking it, you've locked that moisture away. If we've got a recipe that's maybe at 20% moisture, we would think, well, that's quite good. We haven't got too much moisture, it can't go off and create too much havoc, compared to one that's maybe got 70%. But we do need to look at the method, how we've cooked it. If we've just boiled the cream, poured it over the chocolate and whisked it, then we haven't sort of locked that moisture away. Whereas if we've caramelized or if we've used special sugars, then we've locked that moisture away a bit more.
The other thing I'd just like to add as well is it also depends on your equipment you're using. If you're using dirty equipment, then obviously that's not going to give you a good shelf life anyway. The water activity in a ganache or in a caramel, like Claire was saying, is very good, but that's not giving you the real shelf life of that product if you've been using dirty equipment. So that's something else to consider as well.
Okay, so suppose I would be making one of the recipes from the Chocolatier's Kitchen book. In the latest edition, we've added the indicative AW value to each recipe. Now, suppose I would reproduce one of the recipes in the book and I would end up with a different AW value. Would that be an issue, Mark?
No, that's probably quite the norm, actually, to be honest. I mean, if you think about it, ingredients around the country, around the world, is very different from one cream to another, to a different fruit puree and things like that. They're all going to be very different. So I think you need to still do your AW sort of reading if you have a meter. But one of my things I would do for a testing, which is quite easy, is doing a 90-day test on your chocolate. So I would make my chocolates. I would make sure that everything was as clean as possible. Myself is really clean. My workspace is really clean as well. And I'd make a selection of my chocolates. I'd have sort of maybe a couple of hundred chocolates. And then every sort of 2 days, I would try those chocolates. I would cut them open. I would analyze the inside. I would smell them. I would taste them. And then I would record what I'm tasting, and then give it another 2 days. And then I would taste them again, and then another 2 days, and then taste them again. So keeping them well in the perfect storage as you possibly can as well. And then you'll see over those days that you're going through up to sort of like 90 days, you're going to see a difference in that chocolate. You're going to see a difference in that ganache. So then you would know that, okay, my ganache is not performing as well now. It's, the taste is losing. It's not a great chocolate. So I'd come back for that. And that would be sort of my sort of use by date of that chocolate in a sense. Again, like I was saying, different ingredients will work in different ways. You make a recipe from this book, it's not always going to have the same AW reading from it. Probably be very close, but it could be very slightly different.
And when you keep those chocolates over that period of time, do you do it at a specific temperature? Do you keep some at a different temperature? Can you maybe touch on that as well?
No, I would probably keep them all at the same temperature. So I would keep them around about sort of 15 degrees, that type of thing. So a little bit sort of under. So if you have a proper chocolate fridge, that's great. You can store them correctly. But I know that obviously when you sell them, you're not going to have all those fridges and things in your environment, in your kitchen, that maybe your shop that you're selling them. And especially if you're selling them on to a company that's going to resell them, they're not always going to have them at that right temperature. So maybe actually it's probably good to try them in both situations. So from a chocolate fridge and then say more like a room temperature environment. So say roughly around about 19, 20 degrees.
Now, apart from measuring tools, there's a lot that you can do to naturally maximize the shelf life of your products. From our previous podcast, we've heard from Martin and Chiro speak about the importance of storage and good hygiene. Now, if we deep dive in storage, what equipment would you as a chocolatier need to store your confectionery products properly? And what would be the best investment, especially when your financial resources are limited?
Chocolate's such a special product, but it does have this knack of taking on flavours, which can be really good, but can be really bad if you're not storing it well. So I would suggest some good quality storage boxes that they're not smelly. You can layer up all your chocolates, all your products into these boxes and keep them in a sort of protected environment. It's really important that the boxes are not smelly, that they don't get that real plasticky smell, because your chocolates will take on that flavour.
For me, I would spend a little bit more money. So I would spend as much as you can on a really good chocolate fridge. So something that has a dehumidifier on it. You can go slightly hotter in the temperatures than a normal sort of domestic fridge. But again, I would still use what Claire was saying with the plastic containers in that fridge. I think that's so important, the temperature of your fridge. A lot of people forget about this temperature. And they just put them into a normal 5-degree fridge, and then obviously they wonder why they have a lot of water on the top of their chocolates, or they get sugar bloom. So having a proper chocolate fridge, in my opinion, is the best investment.
Now that's very helpful. Would you recommend any other tools or basic equipment that could help or optimize the shelf life of your confectionery products?
Well, for me, a hand blender or a Thermomix, something like that, a food processor is brilliant. You're going to get less air in your product, which will make your shelf life slightly longer as well. So something like that, something that you can blend, humidify your mixes, absolutely brilliant. And they don't have to be expensive. I mean, I said Thermomix there. Yes, they're expensive, but hand blenders are just as good, and you can get them a lot cheaper as well.
I would totally agree with Mark. I would be lost in the kitchen without a hand blender. I don't think I could make half the things without our little bar mix. We have several in the academy, and they're just invaluable for making good quality ganaches.
We definitely need to order a new one, I think, Claire. Let's get that on the list.
We do. They've lasted for so many years, but they're on their way out now.
They are.
So in our previous podcast, we also heard some interesting kitchen tips to extend the shelf life in a very simple way. For instance, adding a pinch of salt to your ganache, or the way you emulsify your ganache. Any helpful tips that you want to share with our audience that works for you in the kitchen?
There's a sort of magical percentage where if you get 15% of your water content is relative alcohol, then it will preserve your ganache. So this is a sort of a magical calculation that we've sometimes used, and it means, the alcohol is creating this environment where no sort of bacteria and molds will grow. So yeah, if you can get 15% of the water to be complete alcohol, then you've made a really good state. It does mean that it tastes a very strong alcohol, which is good if you like that kind of thing. But not good in every single product.
Also, I'd add to that, if you wanted to make a sort of ganache last a bit longer, then, you could add more chocolate to it, take out some of the cream. Yes, you're going to get a firmer ganache, but you tend to find that dipped ganaches in robed chocolates are going to be a longer shelf life because they have to be more stable. So you tend to have a little bit more chocolate in that. So that's extending the shelf life a little bit as well.
I think you can look at pH as well. You can look at pH to maybe make things a bit more acidic so that things don't grow. There's lots of different ways indeed.
Let's look also ahead. Callebaut will release our second book, completing the Chocolatier's Kitchen. It will be called The Chocolatier's Shop, and we will focus on everything you need to take into account when starting up your chocolate business. If I decide to start tomorrow, where do I start?
Very good question. I mean, I can't wait for this book to come out. I mean, I wish it came out 10 years ago because it would have really helped me as well. But I think the thing you need to to start with is, where are you going to make your chocolates? Are you going to make them from home? Have you got a small business? Have you got a little factory? You've got to sort of take this into consideration, I think. And I'm sure the book will emphasize, and you'll see interviews with different chocolatiers and how they started. So it'd be really good and really interesting to read.
A book like this is going to be fantastic. It's got first-hand experiences, real life experiences, great insights into the processes, things like HR, marketing, hiring staff, how to deal with environmental health, labelling laws. There's so much to think about, and I believe that this book will really help just on so many levels to give confidence to people to go for it.
You've mentioned something that stands out for me, Claire, and that's real-life experiences. I think that's what makes both books really valuable. Recipes from chefs that was tested by chefs for chefs, and also chefs sharing their stories, business owners sharing their stories. Again, all very real and very realistic. Amazing chefs, great insight you've shared with us again today. And if I could summarize in our conversation, there's a few takeouts. So first of all, I think the environment that you work in is really key. Secondly, it's important to make sure that the storage of your chocolate is just as important as the working with your chocolate. And lastly, there's the new book that's coming out. So definitely keeping an eye out on that. That will really help you to start your business, and lots of other tips and tricks that you need to keep in mind to ensure that you have the best offering for your customers. Chefs, thank you for sharing this with us.
Thanks, Minette. That's been absolutely amazing. It's great to share our knowledge with everybody.
Yeah, thank you, Minette. This has been a great series. It's a pleasure to be invited on. And yeah, everyone go out and buy the book. It's great.
The Chocolatier's Kitchen. After the book, listen to the podcast series about shelf life in confectionery products.
It was great to have you both as part of the series on shelf life, Claire and Mark. A big thank you for all of you that were listening to this podcast. I hope that the contributions and tips we've shared will help you to manage shelf life and offer your customers amazing products for them to keep coming back for more. For now, this is our last podcast in this shelf life series, but we will be back with a new podcast series and more interesting topics. Take care and keep crafting at your best.